All right. This is session number 37 of the Podcast Engineering Show. And just a quick note, we will be taking a break for the holidays starting next week. This will be the last episode for maybe a month and a half, and we will return and resume the show on January 5th. Just wanted to say this up front, so if you see that we haven't posted a show in a while, that you know why. So that's it. This is session 37. Barry, you ready?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Yes! Yes! That's right. Welcome to the show. Yeah. This is the Podcast Engineering Show. My name is Chris Curran. I produce podcasts for Forbes and Dun & Bradstreet, as well as select business authors and companies. And like I said, we'll be taking a break for the holidays here, but we will come back on January 5th. This episode, though, is going to have a lot of cool stuff in it, so don't, stick around. And by the way, I just want to mention also quickly that the courses that I've been working on, I'm going to be working on a different type of course, which is going to be like a 1-week certification program, and I'll tell you guys more about that as I sort of crystallize it and make it into something. But on this show, we bring you podcast production techniques on a silver platter. We get down and dirty. We talk shop about the audio engineering side of podcasting, the hardcore audio side. We talk with podcast producers, engineers, and other specialists. I actually have a background in the music business, in audio engineering, and, worked on a bunch of albums, have a bunch of album credits and all that cool stuff. And since I entered podcasting more than 4 years ago, I noticed a huge lack of audio skills. Most podcasters, they've just never been trained. They just don't know a lot of the basics and a lot of the tricks. So that's what this show is here for. Of course, Barry is with me, and I should know by now, as I fade out my music, I fade out my soundboard, and then I have to stop the music, put up the fader, and then play Barry. But it's okay, right, Barry?
Yeah, oh yeah.
That's right. Barry, what is this show going to sound like for the next 5 or 6 weeks?
There's no activity, no giggle, no nothing.
That's right. There's going to be no nothing. Hey, I'm going to be going to the Podfest Multimedia Expo. It's in Orlando, Florida. It's in February 23rd to the 25th. Chris and Katie Kremitzos put on this awesome event in Florida. It's Podfest. Last year it was called Podfest. This year it's called Podfest Multimedia Expo. So I think they're expanding. It's in a really cool hotel. But I'm going to be one of the speakers there, and it's just a great event. Really well done. You can learn a lot about podcasting. And so if you're going to go, we can definitely meet up and hang out. That's in Orlando, February 23rd to 25th. The other place I'm going to be is in Lexington, Kentucky. That's right. Who knew? This was a hotbed for podcasting. It's the podcasting course. It's in April, actually. April 21st and 22nd of 2017. It's the first course designed for podcasters in medical education, right? It's really going to be awesome. Lexington, Kentucky, April 21st, 22nd. I'll put links to both of those in this post. I don't think I've put links to either of them on the website at all, but of course our website is podcastengineeringschool.com, and this is the show, and we're building the school. It's going to be awesome. You can hear the show anywhere you hear podcasts, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, and all that, and I can promise you a valuable education over time if you listen to this show. In fact, I made a list. I'm going to go through the list later, but in the previous 36 episodes, we've had amazing guests, and we've covered some really great knowledge, material, scenarios, equipment, workflow. It's just been crazy how much really intense content has been in the first 36 episodes. Maybe you've listened to all of them. I think there's a few people that have listened to all of them. Ralph Rivera is not one of them. He's a bum. He told me last week, he's like, oh, I fell behind. I'm only on episode, I just listened to Liza Miller when they have 16 people in the room, all on the one podcast. Anyway, Ralph is awesome. Ralph and his wife were on last episode, and I'm going to cover that in this episode. So what I'm going to cover is basically 4 things. The wisdom of processing. I'm going to talk about processing a little bit. this episode. And the second thing is I'm going to debrief last week's episode, the production, because, I was on location and we actually recorded through Ralph and Carolyn's rig, but I'm just going to talk about how I did the post-production and all that stuff. It's pretty interesting. Then I'm just going to touch on matching and balancing different voices within an episode. So if you record the voices on separate tracks, a lot of times they sound different. And if they sound too different, it'll be a distraction. So if one sounds too good and the other sounds too bad, then anyway, I'm going to talk about how to match them and how to balance them. And the fourth item for this episode is we're going to talk about upgrading your equipment over the holidays. And it's not going to be in terms of like deals and everything, but more in terms of strategy and your overall, the quality of your podcast production. So, because, if you're into audio and equipment, you always got to be upgrading a little bit. In the sales profession, they say the ABC, right? Always be closing. Well, in audio, it's ABU, always be upgrading. All right, maybe not. Maybe I just made that up. Barry, that was kind of lame, right?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Thanks, dude. All right, so today I'm actually using my old microphone, which is a Shure SM7B, and I'm set up here in New Jersey at my parents' house because I'm visiting New Jersey for a few weeks. And I'm going right through the Shure SM7B microphone right into my Mackie mixer. I'm not processing my voice to tape at all, which is very different from my normal setup at home. My normal setup at home is now an RE20 through my channel strip, which is a Neve Portico II, which is a really awesome unit, like disgustingly awesome. And also disgustingly expensive. But anyway, that's the kind of thing you buy once in your life, and literally that's it. You're done. You use it for the rest of your life. Anyway, that's my strategy there. So, but it's funny because setting my levels to record this episode, it was very different. So normally through my Neve Portico II, I'm compressing my voice before it gets recorded, which is awesome because it makes it, tighter and nicer and more present and more closer to you. It's, and the benefit of compressing to tape is that you basically squash down any, transients, any times when the level goes way up, gets loud and then just comes back down. So when you're using a compressor to tape, when you're getting the level on your recorder or on your computer, you could scream into the mic and the level will go up really high, and then you just set it so it's almost coming close to zero. So it's not going over zero, so it's not peaking or distorting. And that's good. That's how you set your level. But it's funny, today I was setting my own level and I'm like, I had my level pretty far up, and then I made some loud sounds and it completely went way over zero. And then I turned the mic preamp down a little bit and I said something loud again, and same thing, it went over. And I had to turn the mic pre so low. So now, like when I make a really loud noise, it'll pretty much go right up to zero, maybe a little below zero. But when I'm talking normal volume, the level's so low because of the dynamic range. And so when the level is lower, it's recording at a lower resolution, basically. And that also affects the sound and the processing later. So that's why I'm pretty much a big fan of recording with compression to tape. Not too much compression, but just a little and just enough. Back when I had my studio here in New Jersey for 3 years, I had a little podcast studio, which was it was in an office. It was a commercial space, and my clients would come in and all that. And I had, 4 mics and a round table, and I had a compressor for each mic because it just helps so much in getting people's levels. And, the old gag when you ask someone, oh, could you talk into the mic so I can get the level? And then they start talking like this. Yes, this is my level. And then you start the show and they're like, oh my God. And so it just, having a compressor just helps a lot. It's just protection, really, in terms of the level that you're recording at. And again, that's why you don't want to compress too much, because you don't want to, mess up the purity of the sound. You just want to control these really loud transients. So the processing, one of the things on and now I'm entering into my first section here of this episode, the wisdom of processing. So processing is any way that you're processing the sound. EQ, compression, limiting, gating, anything, everything. Well, once it's recorded, or even before it's recorded, you can process the signal in many different ways. And part of the wisdom of processing is to not overdo it. And one of the things that amateurs do is they find something that's cool and they just overdo it. They use way too much EQ or way too much, of anything that helps it sound better. They're like, ooh, if I add 1 dB, it sounds better. Oh, let me add 10 dB. It'll sound awesome. And typically it's not true, because you end up adding too much or subtracting too much, and you ruin it. So the wisdom is, just like in spirituality, the middle path. You want to, let's say it's EQ. Let's use the most apt example in podcasting, the low end of the microphone. People want to add a lot of low end so that it sounds like they have a big radio voice, but then they add too much and it sounds dull and doesn't sound present enough. And it's actually a little harder to hear what's being said. So the wisdom is, if you find some frequencies that sound good, like the low end, add a little bit. Don't add too much, just add enough. And in practice, the way that usually happens is you add enough where you think it sounds good, and then, well, you can leave it there, or you can actually back off on it a little bit. So let's say you add 5 dB. Actually, that's a lot. Let's say you add 3 dB of bass, some bass frequencies, and that sounds good. Well, just bring it down to 2.5 or 2, and that's probably what it should be. So on my Neve Portico II channel strip, which I have at home, there's this really cool knob on the right, and it's called Silk. It's called Silk mode. And Rupert Neve and his team they're just legendary in audio processing for mic pre's and everything, really. EQs, my God, the Neve 1073s, those are like the most coveted EQs ever, almost. So on the right side of the Portico 2, there's a Silk mode, and there's 2 different modes, red and blue. And basically what it does in layman's terms is it adds some low end, and I think the blue adds low end and the red adds high end. And that's not exactly what it does. It's actually processing it a little and adding a little frequencies. So it's not just like an EQ. It's actually processing a little bit more. It's hard to explain. But when I first got the Portico 2 and I was using my SM7B back then, I used the Silk mode. I used the red, so it would add a little bit of high end, nice and smooth, high frequencies. It's really nice. And it actually sounded good. I never used the blue Silk because the blue was the low end, and like it, if I was recording a bass guitar or something, I might try that. But and I did try it on my voice, and it was okay. But actually, with that Silk mode, you can only use one. It's just one button, and you choose red or blue. So you can't use both at the same time, which is fine because it's just a subtle enhancement, really. That's what it's supposed to be. So when I was using the SM7B microphone, I used a little bit of the red Silk. When I switched to my RE20 microphone, I tried to use some of the red Silk as well, but something just didn't sound right. And so I tried to add a little bit less of the red Silk, and it was okay. I don't know. And then I just tried it without it, and it was like just a little bit clearer or something. It was like cleaner or clearer without it. And I just decided, you know what? I'm just not going to use either of the silk mode, the red or the blue, because both of them, I tried both of them, and it changed it a little, but it just, I don't know, it didn't make it wonderful. And so, maybe the amateur would say, oh, well, I'll just use a little bit of the red silk, or I'll just even use a lot, whatever. But I was able to actually decide I'm not going to use any of it. So now I have this beautiful option, the silk mode, and I'm not using it on my voice. And you may think, well, it can enhance it. Well, I just didn't think it did. So I'm not going to add something just for the sake of adding it. And that's a little bit of wisdom there. Also, on the very popular unit, the DBX 286S, which is also a channel strip. It's a very good one, actually. That's the one we talked about last episode with Ralph and his wife. They have 4 of them in a big rack, a big road case rig. On the DBX 286S, there's a section called Enhancer. And one of the knobs says low frequency detail, and the other knob says high frequency detail. And really what it is, it's very similar to the silk, but it's not as high quality. It's more just like EQ. It's sort of like an EQ. And if you add low end, or if you turn up the low frequency detail, you're adding low end, and the high frequency detail is the high end. And the DBX 286S is a popular unit because it's not that expensive, but it actually sounds really good. And like we discussed, it has a compressor, a gate, a de-esser, which is so important at times. So again, when you're using the low frequency detail and the high frequency detail on that unit, just be careful you don't add too much, right? Again, find out where it sounds good and maybe just back it off a little. And sometimes it takes some repetition. You have to, you'll set it up this week, and then you'll hear your podcast back after you publish it, and you'll be like, yeah, well, I think I could add a little more low end. And literally, you can go to the knob and just tweak it up 1 tick. And then, literally, that's how small of adjustments you can make over time. And I do that quite often. I'll just, little things, like on the Portico II, sometimes when I was setting the compression for my voice, the release on the compressor, it's a very interesting control, which I hope to talk about, and definitely will talk about in my courses for the podcast engineering school. But the release on a compressor changes the sound a lot, actually, and the perception of the sound. It's hard to explain, but it's kind of like how in your face is the sound, or how close is the sound. I don't know. Anyway, so sometimes with my compressor, I'll just tweak up the release just a hair, or tweak it down, whatever I'm thinking. The other thing you can do with a voice, by the way, when we're talking about processing, is you can use a multiband compressor on your voice or on any voice. And multiband compressors are great. We've talked about them on the show. It's basically the same as a regular compressor, except it breaks the signal down into 4 frequency bands: low, low mid, and high. And it's great because you can set the compression differently for each of those frequency bands. So, and we're not going to get too much into multiband compressors, but I will say that one thing you can do for people who want like the bassy kind of radio voice is what you can do is use a multiband compressor, and the low end, the low frequency, you can actually set that compression to be a little bit more than the other frequencies. So you can compress the low end a little more, and then each band also has a gain, like a makeup gain, right? So when you compress and you squash it down, then you turn up the makeup gain to bring the level back up, right? So you can actually put the gain back up. You can actually boost the low end using a multiband compressor, and the actual low end that you're boosting is nice and compressed and tight. So it actually works really well for that radio voice sound. So that's a really cool trick. The only thing is, again, you can't overdo it, because then it just doesn't sound natural. It doesn't sound clear. And as we've said so many times, The human voice is a very mid-range instrument. So the real low end and the real high end, we don't need much of that, or else it starts to sound very unnatural. All right, so let's talk about last week's episode. We're going to debrief just a little bit. And last week, I was down with Ralph and Carolyn Rivera at their place, and we recorded the episode through their mobile rig, and we described it. So if you haven't heard that episode, you can go listen to it. So a couple things I noticed after doing the post-production on that episode and publishing it was that there was a little too much compression on our voices. And the reason that happened is because, like I mentioned earlier, when we did the sound check, people were talking normal and, okay, this is my sound check. But once we started, the energy got amped up and everybody was just that much louder, especially me. I definitely get pumped up when I do this show, right? So anyway, once we started, the level going into the compressor was much louder, so the compressor really smashed it down and compressed it. Now, you didn't hear much compression because that 286S unit is a good unit. It's nice compression. It's very transparent, which is awesome, which is why it's a great unit. So too much compression, and combine that with the fact that we were in the dining room, which was part of the kitchen kind of thing, which it was all hardwood floors, and there was definitely a lot of reverb happening in that space. So when those two things combined, too much compression and a lot of reverb in the space, what you're really doing is when you're compressing the voice, you're smashing down the voice, and really you're making the reverb louder, the room louder. So when you're in a space that has a lot of reverb or echo, you can use compression, but just try not to overdo it, because then you're actually just bringing up the reverb and the echo. So that's a balance. And I also told Ralph, because he's not an audio engineer, but he knows what he's doing. This was like one of their first times recording through the rig. I told him that when you sound check people, look at the equipment, get the level. But then when you start the episode, at least in the first 5 minutes or so, you got to keep looking at the compressors and see how much compression is happening. Because if someone starts getting real loud and they're just way over compressed, you can actually back down on the mic pre. Actually, that's usually the best thing to do. In fact, a little, hint or secret, I don't know what it is. When I set up my DBX units, I set, the input level with the mic pre, and then there's the compression settings, then there's the output level. And when I get into recording an episode, if I ever need to adjust the level because someone either got louder or softer, I only adjust the mic pre. I never adjust the compressor settings or the output or any other setting on the unit, usually. Because if you adjust the input through the mic pre, you're basically adjusting how much of the signal gets fed to the compressor. So you can basically adjust how much compression's happening by turning the level down or up a little bit. Of course, you don't want to make any big adjustments, just, pretty small. So that was good to know. And also, I noticed that Ralph and Carolyn were very close to their mics. They have the Heil PR40s, and I was very close to the mic as well. But when I was at their house previously a couple years ago, they were kind of close to the mic, but not right on the mic. And this time they were both right on the mic. And that really helps a lot. Again, especially in spaces where there's reverb or anything like that. The closer you can get to the mic, the cleaner the signal's going to be, the less of the room that you're going to hear. The other thing about last week's episode was the gating. Ralph wanted to use the noise gate while recording. And I suggest never to use a gate on, to tape when you're recording. Use the gate after it's recorded. Because as you heard last week, there were times when my breath got cut off or someone's breath got cut off. And it just sounds awkward and it brings attention to itself. And so I would always say use a gate later. Ralph wanted to use the gate. He just, it's his setup, it's his equipment. He felt like he wanted to use it. I mean, look, if a gate could be set perfectly, then yes, you would use it. The problem is it's so hard to adjust the gate depending on all the different variables, the person speaking, how close they are to the mic, the room you're in. I mean, if someone is speaking right into the mic and you set the controls for the gate, if they move back 4 inches, that it's going to affect the gate so much. It's going to just start cutting them off way sooner. So you may think you have a gate set properly, but then the signal changes a little and it just all of a sudden it starts cutting in and out. So that's rough. I mean, during recording, that's rough. I would never mess with that. I would never do that. Are you kidding? Well, and I'm also coming from the studios where, like, okay, if Mariah Carey's laying down her vocal track, you don't want to cut off her breath, because when the take ends and you can say, "Oh yeah, Mariah, can you just do that again? Because we got to set the gate better or something." I mean, are you kidding me? So you just have to capture it as best you can and process it after. It's easy to use a gate afterwards. There's literally almost no reason to use a gate to tape. The only reason is, and we've talked about this before, the only reason to use a gate before you're recording is if you're taking like 4 microphones and you're mixing it through a mixer and just recording it on, a little portable digital recorder. Meaning you're not recording multitrack. You're mixing it all down live and recording it all into one track live. Okay, then you may want to use one. But again, setting it properly and all that, it's not easy. It's not easy. So, and also, guess what I did with the tracks from last week? I put them into, because I didn't really have time to mess around with it by hand. I put our 3 tracks, so it was me, Ralph, and Carolyn. So those 3 tracks I put into Auphonic Multitrack. And I used the crossgate function. And what the crossgate function basically tells Auphonic that, look, these 3 mics are in the same room. So that, let's say, when Chris is talking and the other 2 mics those people are not talking, you can actually just gate them. Just shut them off because they're not talking. So Auphonic the cross-gating, it's like an automatic gate. And you just feed the 3 voices in and it'll automatically detect, okay, if one mic's talking, you can sort of gate the other 2, mute the other 2. And then when someone starts talking, you unmute them, right? You let the signal come through. So it's kind of like an intelligent way to do that, which I kind of like. The only thing I don't like, and this is, I really didn't like this. So when you put 3 tracks into Auphonic Multitrack, you get out 1 track, right? And they're all mixed together, and it's good. But you probably know what I like to do is, if there's going to be several voices on a podcast, I like to pan them a little bit. One voice, my typical panning is when I have one guest, I am panned 11% to the right. My guest is panned 11% to the left. Or wait, I'm on the left. The guest is on the right. But I pan each one 11%. And it just makes it a little wider. It just adds a little separation, makes each voice clearer when there's when one is talking over the other just a little bit, that kind of thing. Or when one person's laughing while the other person's talking. It's a real nice separation. It's very subtle. That's a great technique for podcasting. So, but when you use Auphonic Multitrack, it just spits them out in one file, and they're all panned up the center. So you can't get that little bit of separation. And I don't even know if there's a way with Auphonic Multitrack to, if you could feed it stereo tracks. So let's say Ralph's voice, I could, instead of being a mono track, I could make it a stereo track and pan him a little to the left, and Carolyn, again, make it stereo, pan her to the right, then feed the stereo tracks to Auphonic and have it come back with a stereo track where they're still panned. I'm pretty sure you can't do that. I think it's all done in mono. So that was a little bit of a bummer, but you know what? for speed and ease of production, I just had to do that. I didn't have time because I've been traveling. I drove from Colorado Springs to New Jersey, and I had a lot of things to do when I got here to New Jersey, so I didn't have all the time in the world to do post-production on that one episode, which I thought came out really good in the end. I mean, certainly for podcast quality, it was very good. All right, the third thing we'll talk about now is matching and balancing the sound of voices within an episode. So in my experience, when I'm hosting a show and I have a guest, and actually I'm just going to use the real Brian as an example, which was a few episodes ago. The real Brian came on the show, and he has a setup where he has added, he's going for that big radio voice. He's added a lot of low end. And so my setup is my setup. It's pretty much always the same. So I recorded both our voices during that interview. And when I went to do post-production, my voice sounded, as far as frequencies go, pretty normal. You know, not too much low end, not too much high end and all that. His voice sounded really bassy. So what you can try to do, and it makes a lot of sense, you try to, like, if his voice was way more bassy than my voice, just take some of the bass out of his voice. Just so there's not such a huge difference in frequencies. You kind of want to match up the frequencies. I mean, look, you can't really match them up really well, but if it's blatantly obvious that one guy is way more bassy, then you just got to take some bass out of that. Same thing with the high end. If let's say my microphone was dull on the high end, not really crispy, and his had a really nice, pristine high end, nice, clear, and a nice sheen on his voice, then the voice that's a little more dull, you would try to add some high end to, because you don't want one person sounding crystal clear and the other one sounding dull. So you can, if there's any blatant discrepancies in level between the low end and the high end of different voices, you can use that as a cue to tweak that in the EQ. So that's actually what I did with the real Brian. I took out a lot of low end on his, and I may have even added some mid range or high mids, or high end. I'm not sure exactly what I did, but it just made our voices basically the same frequency range or the same frequency levels, so that it's easier to balance them. And then it's also easy, of course, it's also easier for the listener to understand both equally, right? Because that's why we're doing all this audio engineering stuff, is so that the listener doesn't notice anything. They just hear each person clearly and at very similar level, so they don't have to ride their volume knob, and boom. The other place this is really applicable is sometimes if you ever record a phone call, or especially if you're doing anything on Skype, sometimes Skype, if it's a good connection, the high frequencies will come through really well. Other times, Skype just makes things really dull. Really dull. Like it might even change the sample rate of what it's, of how it's sampling the sound. So normally, well, CD quality is 16-bit 44.1 kilohertz. Skype might take it down to 20 kilohertz. And if it takes it down to 20 kilohertz, that means that means the highest frequency that it's capturing is 10K. So half of the frequencies that you can hear with the human ear are not captured. They're just not there. So it sounds dull. It just doesn't sound crisp. So Skype does that. Phone conversations can do that too. So that's the thing. If, let's say I'm recording myself locally, really high quality, right? With good low end, good high end, everything's good. And I get someone on the phone or on Skype where their high end is really lacking, I might have to add more high end to them just to match them up with me. And same thing if their low end is too much. That's another thing that happens on Skype. You have to roll off so much low end off of the signal. It's crazy. Sometimes you can roll off almost all the low end, and then it sounds good because there's so much low end coming through Skype. That's very common. So the other thing is sometimes, like if I'm matching someone up with my voice, like I know my voice is good as far as frequencies go. Normally. Today's setup's a little different. I'm going to mix it in post, but it should still be the same. But sometimes you'll have two voices where they're both kind of messed up in different ways. Maybe one has a lot of low end and the other one has no high end. So, you kind of have to listen to them together. And even on this show, I can't remember who it was. One of my guests said that when they have someone on the phone, they make the phone sound the best sound they can, but he said on his microphone, even though his sound is good already, he'll actually remove some of the high end just so his voice doesn't have way more high end than the phone call. It might have some more high end, but not way more. So that's just one little technique to sort of match and balance the voices within an episode. Pretty handy. And then the last thing is upgrading your equipment over the holidays. And look, I'm not going to talk about deals, but I want to talk about strategy. I actually pinged Mark Johansson before this episode and see if he could send me any idea about deals or anything like that. But what's cool is he has a Facebook group, which you should be part of if you're into podcasting and equipment. His Facebook group is called Podcast Gear Group. And it's easy to get to, podcastgeargroup.com. And in that group, he's always posting deals and talking about gear. It's really awesome. I don't know how he does it. He must live on his computer and deals, and I don't know how he does it, literally, but he posts so much cool stuff. It's awesome. So, and I'll put the link to that in the show notes here as well. But Mark Johansson's Facebook group is a great resource for equipment deals. And that's why I'm not going to talk about him on this episode. Just go there. But I will talk about upgrading your equipment over the holidays in terms of strategy. Okay, so it's the holidays. Well, what do you want for Christmas? What do you want for Hanukkah? Whatever, or New Year's, I don't know. Does anyone give New Year's gifts? I don't think so. But anyway, there's a lot of stuff being bought and money spent. So sometimes the holidays is a great time to tell your wife or your husband, you know what I really want? I want a Scarlett 18i8 or something, right? So it's a good time to upgrade. And as far as strategy, this is what I wanted to mention, that it's not if you want to upgrade your sound, you don't have to literally throw out all the equipment you have and buy all new equipment. You can actually just upgrade one of the pieces of equipment. And then maybe the next year or the next 6 months later, upgrade another piece of equipment. But the thing you have to do is you have to be very strategic about this. You have to make sure they're compatible. You have to make sure that you're on a path to building a setup that is really what you want and something that'll work. So that's why it starts, again, begin with the end in mind. Begin with, what do you want eventually? Do you want to record everything multi-track and have several computers and have a nice big audio interface? Kind of like what I have. All right. Or do you just want to stay really slim and lean and whatever? And maybe you just want to upgrade the audio interface to the computer with better mic pre's. I know a lot of people, in fact, some people producing podcasts still don't use an audio interface. They just use the little mini plug into the head, come out of the headphone jack of the computer. And when they come out and they go into the computer through that little mini microphone jack. Okay, fine. Do whatever you got to do. But that's clearly an area where you could upgrade to a Focusrite Scarlett 2i2. I mean, these are great units. What are they? $150, have really nice mic pre's. They're very compatible. Anyway, that's just one example, but strategy. Think about the rig or the setup that you want, and then figure out, sometimes you might want to buy an interface first. Other times you may want a new mixer first. It depends. Sometimes you want one before the other, so just give it a little thought And maybe over the holidays you can upgrade. And by the way, if you do upgrade, definitely send me a note and pictures. I love pictures. Send me a note, and then I can mention it on the show or even put it on the website, whatever. But it seems like a great time to upgrade because so many people are spending money. You may even want to give yourself a holiday gift and just buy something for yourself. I mean, use that as an excuse. Come on. A quick example, Mike Michalowicz, who is my co-host on the Profit First podcast, and I used to do another one with him as well. He's here in New Jersey, and he had an office in his home, and I helped him set up a little podcasting studio with a Scarlett 2i2 interface and a little mixer, and he has 2 mics. So he can sit there, and his assistant Christina or his partner Ron can sit there, and they can record the 2 mics on 2 different tracks and all that. And of course, he can connect with me and others over the internet and record that way. So he just moved into another office space, which is outside of his home. And he asked me, he said, well, what if I want 3 microphones? What do we have to do? How do we make that happen? And I basically told him, look, the setup you have for 2 microphones is good. If you want to add a 3rd microphone and you want to record all 3 mics on separate tracks, I said, man, this is, you got to upgrade. And maybe the mixer, but certainly the audio interface, because he only has 2 mic inputs to the audio interface. So that's kind of like, in terms of production, that's kind of like a transition point. Like you can have 2 mics and go into a mixer and go into a 2-channel audio interface and record two mics separately. That's fine. That's easy. As soon as you want to step it up to 3, well, now you got to think about it, because now you need 3 microphone inputs to the computer through an audio interface. You need at least 3 microphone channels on your mixer, and then you got to make sure if you need direct outputs out of your mixer, you got to make sure you have that, which is you kind of need that or something like that. There are bussing tricks where you can bus things differently, but if you have a mixer with direct outs, that's the easiest, because then you just take direct out of channel 1 and boom, right into computer. Direct out of channel 2, boom, right into computer, and record them all separately. So he's going to upgrade, and he's going to, actually what's cool is he's going to keep what he already has and maybe set up one computer with his current setup, which is Scarlett 2i2 with the little mixer, but in a different room, in like the conference room where he wants to maybe have 3 or 4 mics, right? Why not have 4? Why have 3? Just round it off to 4. He's gonna buy a new audio interface, which is the Focusrite Scarlett 18i8, which has 4 mic pre's, so it has 4 XLR inputs in it. And we're gonna have to talk about the mixer, how he's gonna handle that as well. I'm actually going to meet with him next week, I think. I'm going to go to his new place, and he wants me to scope out the room and all that kind of stuff. So it'll be fun. But yeah, so he's going to upgrade. And the stuff that he currently has is not going to go to waste, or I'm sure he could sell it, or, sell it to one of his friends or eBay, or I've never sold anything like that, but I'm sure it's not hard to do. Or else just have it as a backup. I don't know. But yeah, so he's going to upgrade, and it's going to work out really well for him. So that's just one example of how you could upgrade. And again, the strategy of thinking about what do you want your final setup to be in terms of framework, maybe not in terms of specific gear, but in terms of, okay, I want to be able to have 4 mics. I want to be able to record 4 microphones each on individual tracks. And maybe you want to have someone come in on Skype as well. Or maybe you want to have 2 computers set up and have 2 different Skype accounts so you can connect with 2 people over the internet. So you can think about it that way. You kind of got to think about it and frame it out and see what you want, and then you could see maybe the first steps in upgrading. So like I said, I'm going to come up with a course, and I pretty much have it, but I told you before, I started to create these online courses, And my goodness, is that a lot of work? And it doesn't seem like the first step for me either. So what I'm thinking about is in-person training. In fact, my vision is to have a 1-week in-person, 1-week certification course where I teach podcast producers and engineers everything I know about podcasting, about production. We can even get into pricing and scheduling and workflow and how to handle clients, how to get clients, whatever, because that's what I've been doing. That's my life. So I'm happy to do that, and that's the plan. So I'm not sure when it's going to happen, but definitely keep an ear out for that. Again, this will be the last show for this year. We'll be coming back on January 5th, that's a Thursday, the 5th. So we come out every Thursday morning. So we're going to take a good 6 weeks off here. I need a break. And, this is episode 37, and I'm serious. The level of guests that we've had over these episodes has been very, very high. And we've learned so much from them. So if you haven't listened to any of them, go ahead and listen to the backlog. And even listening to the guests that you really love the second time, of course, that never hurts because you always miss things, right? And I know sometimes I use some words or some jargon that's, you may never have heard of. So sometimes the second time around you catch it. But I do want to thank every single guest I've had on this show. That's right. This is not going to take long, but Ralph and Carolyn Rivera, The Real Brian, Greg Heist, Jonathan Messenger. Remember Jonathan Messenger? Brian Adolph, Scott Weingart, Cliff Ravenscraft, Cody Boyce, Brian Orr. Remember Brian Orr? Ray Ortega, Joshua Rivers, Liza Miller. Yes, Alan Mead, Chris Saunders, Georg Holtzmann, Mary Mazurik. Remember Mary? I also did a recap of my Q&A session from Podcast Movement last year. That was a whole episode. I think Ralph Rivera was on that episode with me. Max Flight, Jason Bryant, Daniel J. Lewis, Drew Smith, when he tried to stump me on those microphones. Remember that? Steve Savanu from Audio Technica. We got that whole education on all the different types of microphones and the history of microphones. That was tremendous. Kevin Farkas, Joel Bogus, Carrie Green, Dave Jackson, Justin Crossley, Mike McCallan, Todd Cochran, Daryl Darnell, my goodness, Rob Walsh, David Hooper, Jason Kabasi, Kate Ostrakhan, Louis Congdon, and Mary and Blake Larson. Remember episode 1, Mary and Blake Larson? That was pretty cool. In fact, I've seen online recently that they were building their new studio. So you know what? I'm going to have to reach out to them because if it's all set up and running, then I'll have to have them on the show again. And we'll have to go over their whole new setup and all what they've learned. It's just amazing. I really love doing the show because you learn so many little things from everybody. There have been many guests who've come on that said, "Ooh, I'm not an audio engineer. I don't know how much I have to add." Trust me, if you're doing this, if you're learning and picking up little tips from everywhere and learning pieces of equipment or plugins, trust me, you're learning a lot. You may not have the pedigree of a real audio engineer and you might not have that knowledge, but you do have a lot of knowledge and you do have things that are valuable to share. So if you're listening to this and you do produce your own podcast or you produce podcasts for others, definitely send me a note. And I'd love to have you on the show. We could chat about everything, your equipment and workflow. This has been great. So thank you all so much for listening. I'm so happy to be able to do this show and participate with so many of you. As you know, I'm not like this high and mighty guy who knows everything. I know some things and I'll share what I know. I'm happy to say I don't know. And I thank you for joining me on this trip of learning and knowledge and education in audio engineering side of podcasting. So thank you. We'll be back on January 5th. Until then, sound great!